Anybody in the room have any idea how much coal will be consumed in the world in 2023? And they all sort of looked at me rather blankly because they think coal's disappeared. We don't use coal anymore, do we? Well, the number is 8 billion tons. Can you believe that? Think about it, 8 billion tons. 2023 is forecast to be the biggest coal usage year ever in the history of humankind.
Hello and welcome to This Week in Review with Nigel Farage. Nigel, it's the first week back, and I want to start with an analysis of the stock market. And I want to know whether you put much weight to this type of analysis. It's all about statistics and how stock markets are expected to perform based on what they did last year. And the overarching idea is that it's very rare for the US stock market to have 2 down years in a row. And that suggests that next year it's going to go up. Do you believe that sort of thing?
Well, there is an historical, equation there that says it's rare. Yeah, okay, fine, I get that. The other theory that's doing the rounds in the last 48 hours is that if the stock market has a strong start in January, and, January is the sort of Monday of months, isn't it, really? I mean, it's the sort of most miserable month of the year for a lot of people. So the other theory doing the rounds is that because we've had a strong start in January, that also indicates it's going to be a real boom, bumpy year for stock markets. So there is a rising bullish consensus, very interesting, and it's coming from a lot of commentators on both sides of the pond. Overwhelming bullish consensus. I have to express a degree of skepticism. First reason, we have the most incredibly mild winter in Europe thus far. I mean, it was 19 degrees in Warsaw the week before Christmas. I mean, completely unheard of. And so what's happened is the energy shock that was expected to hit Europe hasn't. And people like the Germans have, very sensibly built up 90% storage on gas. They're opening coal mines. So we haven't had that shock that was expected, and that clearly has given people a sense of relief. But that's not to say that our energy problems have gone, because they're not. We might get a cold February, who's to say? The other aspect of this that I think is very interesting is, again, an overwhelming consensus from those who never saw inflation coming, who, when it did, said it would be merely transitory. And regular viewers of this will remember this over the last 18 months. Now, the consensus is, by September, inflation will at least have halved and will have gone back down, and all will be well. Well, 2 things to say on that. One, history does suggest that when inflation sets in, it takes longer to disappear. That disease of money takes longer to disappear than anybody ever anticipates. And secondly, I could be wrong, but I just have a nasty feeling that we haven't seen the worst in Ukraine yet. And the inflation I'm talking about here in particular is food price inflation. So many of the crops that would have been sowed to be harvested this spring into summer in Ukraine, I mean, little statistics like 80% of the sunflower oil we buy in supermarkets comes from Ukraine. So I am fearful that food price inflation may well stick around and be a lot more obstinate than people think. And I also fear more energy shocks. Okay, fine. Natural gas is currently trading below where it was before February of last year, although that's still, of course, at relatively high levels. So I think the risks, where's the next really big move on natural gas prices? I don't think it's down. I think the risk is that it's up. So I don't share this sort of wild optimism about inflation or about stock markets.
Yeah, they seem quite arbitrary, the way these things are analyzed when it comes to stocks. One of the statistics that I heard is that stocks don't bottom out until central banks start cutting interest rates. And so far, they're continuing to raise them. So that's another argument why we may not have seen the worst for stocks yet. I want to ask you, though, about something you mentioned there. This unusually warm winter has prevented the energy crisis in Europe from getting as bad as it might have. Do you think this will allow European politicians to fail to learn the lesson that they should have learned and therefore to change course on some of their energy policies?
I was at a dinner this Monday, no names, no pack drill, private room, several ex-cabinet ministers, people of very high rank, some lawyers, some green energy business types. And I have to tell you, they have no intention of changing course whatsoever. Absolute commitment round the table to net zero, a belief that what we're doing will save the world. And I just said to them casually, I think I was there as the jester, I just said to them casually, anybody in the room have any idea how much coal will be consumed in the world in 2023? And they all sort of looked at me rather blankly because they think coal's disappeared. We don't use coal anymore, do we? Well, the number is 8 billion tons. Can you believe that? Think about it, 8 billion tons. 2023 is forecast to be the biggest coal usage year ever in the history of humankind. And we need to learn a lesson from that, which is whatever we think about carbon dioxide and its link to global warming, that we are on a path to huge destructive self-harm by having expensive energy, by damaging manufacturing, by causing fuel poverty, which we're seeing already on a huge level. So as yet, I don't think British politicians have learned, but I think the Germans have woken up. I think the Germans have genuinely had a shock. I think realizing just how beholden they become on Russia, and we're seeing a big move towards coal in Germany. They can say what they like at COP27, how virtuous they are, but the fact is the Germans are acting now in their own national self-interest. I sense in Italy that Giorgia Meloni is beginning to move in this direction as well. So the answer to the story is that the Brits are very, very slow on this, but I actually think we're seeing some significant changes in public opinion around this issue, a bit more realism about what's going on in India, China, and Indonesia. And I kind of think, well, at some point there's going to be a change. The other big shift I'm seeing is attitudes towards nuclear energy. The arguments, and we know the downsides, it's not cheap. We know the downsides, there's radioactive waste to deal with. We know all that. But the argument that it gives you base load power, entirely predictable base load power, and it's got zero carbon emissions, even the Greens in parts of Europe are beginning to change their mind. So I do actually think, final answer to the question, I do actually think there are going to be some big energy changes, big energy policy changes in time. I just think the Brits will probably be the slowest.
There's been a bit of a flurry of news in this area as well, with a major project to supply solar power from Australia to Singapore falling apart over the last few days, and then British Volt in the UK struggling. But let's return to sort of the average person, the average household, especially in the UK. Fuel poverty is becoming a genuine problem despite this mild winter. And if we don't have as mild a winter next year and we continue to have these energy problems, then it's setting things up for another crisis, really, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, had the natural gas price continued to go up, then what would have happened is the cap would have kicked in, and the government would have been on the hook for tens of billions. That doesn't look like it's going to happen at this stage. But as I say, despite all of that, the average household bill is roughly double what it was this time last year. There's about 3 million people on prepaid meters who at some point in the last year have struggled to keep the electricity on or have had it go off for a period of time. You've got to add to that the fact that a lot of people under 40 have had their whole adult lives in a period of effectively zero interest rates. An assumption that zero interest rates were the norm, and they've got themselves mortgaged up, and they're finding their weekly, monthly bills for food, for electricity, for everything, for filling the car up, for all of these things are much, much higher. So, there is speculation today that up to 750,000 young people with mortgages may well struggle over the course of this year to meet those repayments. So the cost of living crisis is very real. It may not be in the headlines in quite the way that it was a few months ago, but it's there and it's very, very real. And that suggests, that the UK property market will be a bit softer for a period of time. But as I say, back to the start of this conversation, we're not out of the woods yet. We are really not out of the woods yet, despite what, every stockbroker analyst wants you to believe.
If the energy crisis does persist and it becomes a major political issue, do you trust that the voting British public to sort of support energy solutions that make sense to us, like nuclear and gas and so on and so forth? Or do you think they're going to, vote for left-wing politicians who, promise the world and deliver poor results, or perhaps they'll focus on green? Do you think, if energy security and energy supplies become a political issue, that will solve the problem?
It's very interesting that there is a generational divide on this that is truly astonishing. Truly astonishing. An overwhelming number of under 30s believe that the world's going to end, that billions are going to die, that it's all our fault, and that if we switch to electric cars, somehow we're all going to be saved. Interesting to note, by the way, driving an electric car now long distance is more expensive than using petrol. Can you believe it? So we have a younger population who, from primary school all the way through university, have only been given one side of an argument, the catastrophe argument. That is reinforced by Sky News, the BBC. Every weather event is now put down to global warming and man causing it. So it's a really interesting one. And, political parties and commercial companies always want the young to be on their side. And this explains, I think, some of the woke type attitudes we see from some of the big corporates. They're scared about this younger population. So it's difficult to say how this pans out. But definitely, I think you'll see that the Labour Party will not shift position on this at all. They are doing overwhelmingly well with young voters compared to the Conservatives. They will not risk any of that. And as we're likely, I think, to have a Labour government, within the next 18 months, 2 years, as I say, I don't see British policy changing on this, but I do see it ultimately becoming quite a big argument from the more conservative side of British politics, but not if Boris Johnson comes back. Not that I think he will. So it's a really interesting one. And normally we expect people aged 21 leaving university with left-wing views to become more conservative as they get older. There is a little bit of evidence suggesting that actually that is not happening in quite the way that it used to. So it's this is a long-term thing.
It seems to me that energy supply and energy security is almost too important to leave to governments and to the political process. There's some things we just don't trust the government to run our lives for because it's been a disaster, such as food supplies and shelter and all these sorts of things. And it seems to me like energy is not well suited to the political process and to being handled by the political process because, well, we can see why. But let's move on to that.
I mean, look, energy planning, sensible energy planning, you actually have to be looking 20 years ahead.
Yeah.
Literally, you have to look 20 years ahead. And it's why the warnings that some journalists put out in the year 2000 have proved to be so accurate, because we've had no long-term strategy. We've seen our nuclear power stations disappear, a massive over-reliance on renewables, a lack of understanding that when the wind doesn't blow, we're in trouble. So we got rid of our gas storage facilities. Yeah, you're right. But, this goes back to one of the most fundamental arguments about civilization. The European Union was set up in the 1950s, or the EEC as it then was, based on the belief that democracy is inconvenient because the ship goes in one direction for 4 years and then tacks to another direction for the next 4 years, and that actually what you need is long-term economic management. That's what the European Commission was set up to do. That's what the Soviet Union was set up to do with its 5-year plans. And I think we have to conclude with all of this, Nick, that however unsuitable at times our short-term democratic political decisions are seen to be, the alternative is a form of totalitarian rule. And there's nothing in the middle, in my opinion.
Well, there's also the free market option. But let's move on to the idea that both of us picked up on in the Telegraph. I'll just read the headline because it makes it nice and simple. More than 750,000 households at risk of mortgage default. Financial Conduct Authority warns MPs over wave of missed payments. I think this is going to be the crisis of 2023. It's going to be remarkably similar to the subprime crisis in the US. And I think it's going to play out in Australia and in the UK in dramatic fashion. Do you think I'm right?
Yeah, I think, you know, we had this with the subprime crisis. We had this in the early 90s during the ERM period, you know, record house repossessions, record business bankruptcies too in that period. Yeah, a lot of young people who never thought interest rates could rise, who are suffering generally, are going to be handing back the keys. You know, it's going to happen. It's going to become a political issue. And it will play into the narrative of broken Britain. I mean, nothing bloody works here anymore. You know, the NHS doesn't work. It looks like the mortgage market is about to hit the rocks. We can't even launch a satellite. I mean, the much vaunted first ever launch of a satellite from UK shores, even that doesn't work. And the mortgage story, the debt story, will continue to play into that narrative that we are living in broken Britain, that we've had 12 years of a Conservative administration, but nothing's worked. And I think we are inevitably heading for really quite a big Labour victory.
But you're not anticipating this to become a financial crisis similar to 2008?
No, I don't think we're quite as highly geared on stuff that was frankly unsaleable again. And you also have to understand that the demography of the United Kingdom, you know, our population is growing so quickly that at the bottom end of the property market, there are always going to be buyers. So for individuals, it will be a truly horrible thing. But ultimately, you know, there is quite a strong underlying well of support for buying property in this country, just given demography.
Well, it seems like 2022 was dramatic, but 2023 is sort of potentially going to be just as dramatic. And I don't know whether to hope it will be or it won't be. But either way, Nigel, thanks for joining us. And everyone at home, thanks for watching.